Assalamu alaikum everyone. Thank you very much for joining today. We're going to start the program with the recitation of Quran. Let's start with Quran. Salatu ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحاقة ما الحاقة وما أدراك ما الحاقة كذبت ثمود وعاد بالقارعة فأما ثمود فأهلكوا بالطاغية وأما عاد فأهلكوا بريح صرصر عاتية سخرها عليهم 7 ليال و8 أيام حسوما فترى القوم فيها صرعى كأنهم أعجاز نخل خاوية فهل ترى لهم من باقية وجاء فرعون ومن قبله والمؤتفكات بالخاطئة فعصوا رسول ربهم فأخذهم أخذة رابية إنا لما طغى الماء حملناكم في الجارية لنجعلها لكم تذكرة وتعيها أذن واعية فإذا نفخ في الصور نفخة واحدة وحملت الأرض والجبال فدكتا دكة واحدة فيومئذ وقعت الواقعة وانشقت السماء فهي يومئذ واهية والملك على أرجائها ويحمل عرش ربك فوقهم يومئذ 8 يومئذ تعرضون لا تخفى منكم خافية فأما من أوتي كتابه بيمينه فيقول هاؤم اقرءوا كتابيه إني ظننت أني ملاق حسابيه فهو في عيشة راضية في جنة عالية قطوفها دانية كلوا واشربوا هنيئا بما أسلفتم في الأيام الخالية وأما من أوتي كتابه بشماله فيقول يا ليتني لم أوت كتابيه ولم أدر ما حسابيه يا ليتها كانت القاضية ما أغنى عني ماليه هلك عني سلطانيه خذوه فغلوه ثم الجحيم صلوه ثم في سلسلة ذرعها 70 ذراعا فاسلكوه إنه كان لا يؤمن بالله العظيم ولا يحض على طعام المسكين فليس له اليوم هاهنا حميم ولا طعام إلا من غسلين لا يأكله إلا الخاطئون فلا أقسم بما تبصرون وما لا تبصرون إنه لقول رسول كريم وما هو بقول شاعر قليلا ما تؤمنون ولا بقول كاهن قليلا ما تذكرون تنزيل من رب العالمين ولو تقول علينا بعض الأقاويل لأخذنا منه باليمين ثم لقطعنا منه الوتين فما منكم من أحد عنه حاجزين وإنه لتذكرة للمتقين وإنا لنعلم أن منكم مكذبين وإنه لحسرة على الكافرين وإنه لحق اليقين فسبح باسم ربك العظيم صدق الله العلي العظيم.
Thank you very much for that beautiful recitation. We had, just before we so today we had planned to have a talk by Ambassador Luqman Faili, who is the ambassador of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the former official spokesperson for the President of Iraq and the former Chief of Staff to the Minister of Foreign Affairs, but on democracy and political developments in Iraq, achievements, challenges, and future prospects. But unfortunately, we haven't been able to, unfortunately, the speaker has not been able to join today. So instead, what we're going to do is we're going to have a talk on the future of the JCPOA with Biden as the US president. What will the US and Iran do? And to give this talk will be our very own Iqbal Asaria, who will be speaking to us on this topic. Thank you very much, Iqbal Asaria, for filling in at the last minute. And so without further ado, Assalamu alaikum. And let's start with Salat ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم إني وجهت وجهي للذي فطر السماوات والأرض حنيفا وما أنا من المشركين. Sisters and brothers, Assalamu alaikum. As we know now, I am regularly, not so regularly recently, but generally regularly, a very reliable spare tire for our actions. So now you realize that why a spare tire, the best thing to happen to a spare tire is not to be used. But when it is there and it is reliable, then it does its function. So inshallah, today we have had this that the ambassador probably is able to join because of whatever reason, we don't know yet to find out. So I am trying to say a few words about this JCPOA. Those people who do not know what JCPOA was the accord negotiated during the time of President Obama with Iran and 5 other powers: United States, China, Russia, Germany, and France. This was to deal with the issue of Iran's developing nuclear capability. From day one, Iran said we have intention to build a nuclear weapon, but we need nuclear technology for a number of things, including power generation and so on. West has always contended that maybe Iran is slowly and surreptitiously building itself to become a nuclear power at some stage. The steps involved are not dissimilar in the sense that you have to master several technologies, especially in the field of uranium enrichment, to get anywhere on this. And under pressure from Israel mostly, the United States and Europe to some extent decided to discuss with Iran how they would police and limit its nuclear capabilities. Iran is a member of the International Atomic Energy Authority and also of the Nuclear Accord, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. And so it was bound by these things, but it is not committed to the special conditions of the NNPE, which require much more intrusive inspection and so on, because it says there is no need. To start with, first strange thing is that Israel, which is commonly recognized as having several hundreds nuclear warheads, not a member of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, and it is not officially a nuclear power, although the nuclear weapons were given to Israel from smuggling from Europe, America, and so on. And ironically, as Bishop Tutu wrote recently in a very interesting piece in The Guardian, the United States declares Israel as a nuclear power. By US law, it ceases to benefit from a large number of things from which it is getting from the United States at the moment. So the United States also is playing a children's game. We don't know, it's undeclared. We don't know whether it has nuclear power or not. But Israel's aim has been to limit nuclear, or even not, I'm not talking about nuclear weapons, nuclear power in the region, and specifically in Iran. Those of you remember, after the JCPOA was negotiated during the Obama time, it was about to be signed, the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu visited Washington and addressed both houses of Congress, telling them not to allow this to be put into action. And even an Israeli Prime Minister going over the head of the US President, addressing both houses of Congress to make this appeal. It was very strange, and if it was any other country, we'd be booted out of the United States. I mean, who are you to come and address our Congress? But that gives you just an idea of the kind of mentality this US Congress has. Definitely the Republicans, and also quite a number of Democrats. So there are a lot of hidden agendas in this. However, at that time it was written that the JCPOA was probably the best achievable deal to calm down tensions, and it gave about 15 years before Iran was released from any conditions under the JCPOA. In return, of course, all the sanctions and other restrictions on Iran trade and oil sales, etc., were to be removed. And those who recall that during the first 3 or 4 months after signing of JCPOA, a lot of the events happened. Iran was signing contracts with Airbus, with Boeing, with this, with that. All kinds of things were going on, and everything looked as if it was on track. Now, unfortunately, the presidency was won by Donald Trump, whose one of his main pledges was to revoke this JCPOA. So true to his word, Trump, when he came to power within a few months, he cut this deal. He said, we are no more part of the deal. Fine, we are no more part of the deal. But then he started slapping sanctions upon sanctions upon sanctions. There's thousands of sanctions. And started to threaten other people who want to trade with Iran with secondary sanctions if they went ahead. As a result, Iran's links to the international financial system, official oil sales, all kinds of trade deals was completely blocked. It's very interesting here. One of the clauses in the JCPOA is something called snapback. Snapback was a mechanism which the Western powers had put there to say that if for any reason Iran did not fulfill its part of the bargain, then any one of those countries would have the right to snap back all the sanctions before the JCPOA, which existed before the signing of the agreement. And even after withdrawing, but just before withdrawing, Trump sent his ambassador to the UN, Nikki, to the International Atomic Energy Authority offices and told them that we want you to find Iran in non-compliance of the agreement. The IAEA said we can't because they are compliant to the letter of the law. So we can't do that. He came back disappointed, and then Trump withdrew from the deal. During the last 6 months of Trump's presidency, and this is very strange, Mike Pompeo, who was his Secretary of State, Trump himself, wanted to invoke the JCPOA because Iran had stopped complying with certain parts of the deal. And even the Europeans, who are normally poodles of the United States, said that you are not part of it, you have withdrawn from it. How can you invoke JCPOA when you're not part of something? And Trump was just not willing to listen and continued until in the United Nations, he couldn't find any support and he went away. Now he's gone. Biden, one of his pledges was to restore the JCPOA. The question now is how to do that. Because in the meantime, once Trump went out of JCPOA, Iran had slowly started to breach a lot of the conditions, which were reversible, but still just to give a signal, if I'm not getting any benefit, you are withdrawn. So why should I be limited by these conditions? So in terms of production of the amount of enriched uranium, the level of enrichment and all kinds of other things are beginning to be relaxed. Iran has also threatened to withdraw from the special protocol of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty with the IAEA if things continue as they are. Anybody looking at this would see that want to revive the deal, the United States has to come back into compliance, and then Iran will come back into compliance. There is no two ways about it. Biden started to bully again in the beginning to say that Iran must comply first and then we will comply. And Iran said, well, there is no go here. We have been here several times before. We have been betrayed. So this is not going to happen. Iran will also have some observations on the snapback provision because that could be used to ruin the deal, whatever deal emerges. In the meantime, there is another development in the United States where they have started to talk of nuclear-related sanctions and non-nuclear related sanctions. And so now they are saying we can remove the nuclear-related sanctions, but the non-nuclear related sanctions will remain until we negotiate a bigger, wider, more comprehensive, restrictive deal with Iran. Iran now is saying there is no difference between nuclear and non-nuclear. Essentially, what we want, cut out all this crap. What we want is trade and finance to flow freely. Once it does, you can do whatever you like. If it doesn't, it means you have not fulfilled part of the bargain. So in this ping pong, slowly last week, for the first time, there was a indirect discussion in Vienna between the nuclear powers, the P5, and Iran. It wasn't face-to-face with the United States, but it was indirect. It looked to Iran, both parties, that there was some hope. So they agreed to proceed with more discussions. And today there was a second round of discussions between officials and backroom teams, who have also today announced that it has been reasonably constructive. I don't know what it means. And so they are going to meet next Wednesday again to see if there are ways to resolve this. Meantime, the Iranian parliament, of course, has passed a motion that if it doesn't happen by a certain date, I think it is end of April, then Iran will go further with its restrictions. And of course, elections are coming in Iran where there are also factions who don't like the deal at all. There are factions who want to use the deal for their own purposes, so it is quite a complicated scenario in Iran itself as to who pushes what. So it's not easy for Foreign Minister Zarif and Prime Minister Rouhani to carry this can for much longer. And Biden now seems to be understanding. One thing behind which not many people realize is that Biden has appointed quite a number of the people from the Obama administration who negotiated the deal. Some of these require approval of the Congress, and they are still not done. And the Congress is soft pedaling, backpedaling on it. So they might not be in time to do the job. And of course, the Israelis are jumping up and down, saying that if you do that, we will attack Iran and war will break out and this and that and all kinds of things. And of course, their newfound friends in Saudi Arabia and UAE and so on are also drumming that drum that we don't want Iran to have any peace with the West. Iran, in the meantime, has developed slightly more relationships with China, which has its own problem with the United States. And so last week before, they signed a 25-year comprehensive trade and economics program. I don't know the content of it. It's not yet been published, but it looks like creating a counterweight to the West. So that's where we are. That who will blink first? Who has to blink first? Legally, of course, the United States must come into compliance because it broke first. Remove all the sanctions, which is easy or not easy as one would think. I don't think it's not easy. It's quite easy. Rouhani says it takes 1 hour for Biden to sign all the sanctions off, and they will be finished. The international system also needs to get confidence because a lot of companies were sanctioned. They did nothing wrong, or banks. They only traded with Iran, which was permitted, and then the Americans slapped their sanctions on them. So it's quite important that this be done properly if Iran is to benefit from the opening of the trade and finance flow. Now, what is the European stance? Europeans have realized that they are completely powerless. I mean, they were in part of the JCPOA. They could not initiate a single trade or finance deal because the US had sanctioned all the banks and so on and threatened them that if you deal with this part, we will cut your access to the dollar system. So the Europeans have realized that without the consent of the US, they have no power ever. Whatever they talk is only talk. And now they are thinking of how to manage this situation of powerlessness. China, Turkey, Russia, on the other hand, done barter or semi-barter deals with Iran, exchanging goods for oil and other things. And the Iranian economy, without this year is predicted to grow by 2%. So one can see that slowly the Iranian economy is beginning to figure out how to manage with these problems. It's not the best ideal, but it's showing that it is manageable. And this is very important to manage, to be able to manage in the light of such heavy sanctions, completely isolated, is not something to be taken lightly. It is being managed. Of course, there's a lot of cost to it because everything unofficial, everything above the normal channels and so on, the cost is enormous. But a lot of resilience is beginning to build into the Iranian system. I don't know what will happen next week, but if they are able to negotiate a protocol of how to do parallel relaxation of either on the Iran side coming back into full compliance, and on the European and the American side especially removal of all sanctions. It's going to be a tortuous process. You remember the first negotiation of JCPOA, every other day we used to have a really critical moment where the negotiations were about to break down, and then they finally came through. It was a tortuous process. This time, of course, the same enemies, Israel, and added with the Saudis and the UAE are coming into play to try to sabotage any normalization of relationships between the United States and Iran, or even Europe and Iran for that matter. Now, the Biden administration looks half and half on this to me. There are some people who like to do it. There are others who don't want to do it. There are others who fear the power of the lobbies which don't want it in the United States. But given the situation with China and the United States, they might not have much choice if they want to keep any serious foothold in the region. Iran will have to be a player. How it becomes a player and what kind of deal it is able to negotiate, that is up for grabs at the moment. Everybody has to play their cards right. We hope there is no mishaps, misunderstandings, and false flag operations, which are the common, methods of the United States and European powers to create headaches and trouble. Maybe we can see it go through. But if there are these other mischief mongers, like the attack on the Iran tanker last week in the Red Sea, then things can escalate quite rapidly and can get out of hand. So I think I will stop there and leave you for questions. I've done my 25 minutes. Hopefully you will be able to make a little bit more sense of the JCPOA negotiations going on at the moment. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Iqbal Uncle. If there are any questions, whether here on Zoom or on Facebook or YouTube, please feel free to ask, and you can ask directly or I can ask on your behalf. Let's start with the first question that's come in. What is the incentive for Iran to rejoin the JCPOA if now the potential for snapback sanctions will now be in the hands of the US government, which they don't trust?
Well, there are several things. As I said, when you are cut off from the whole international trading system and financial system, it is quite challenging. So if by rejoining Iran can open up, it might be able to recoup a lot of lost ground of the last 5 years in terms of growth and economic potential. Good relationships with as many members is possible. Iran also does not need to be overtly dependent on China and Russia. These are not trusted friends. They are opportunistic friends. In this case, you should develop counterweight in opportunistic friends in Europe and America so that all of them can behave themselves. This is the main thing. Snapback is, where I said, snapback is a issue which will be, I'm sure, part of the negotiation. It might happen that Iran will negotiate that snapback can only be brought in by a vote of the majority of the 5, rather than anyone.
Okay, thank you very much. The next question is about China. Given what China is doing to Uyghur Muslims, why is Iran cozying up to the Chinese government so much?
Two things. I'm not exonerating China or anything. The Uyghur problem is not new. It's 10 years in the making, right? The West has just seized on it at the moment because it suits its purpose. When it doesn't, it will just go quiet on it. So the Western hankering on Xinjiang is really opportunistic. But Iran, yes. And a country like Iran faces very, very hard choices. Either you say we don't deal with anybody like that, or we deal with our interests and try to influence those people with contacts and so on. Iran, as it is hemmed in by all kinds of other things, as I have outlined, has potentially very little option than to deal with China, but deal with it intelligently. They are not dealing with it backing China's action side itself. They are saying, we do not interfere in each other's internal affairs, and Iran would not expect China to interfere in whatever other issues may come inside Iran. The West, on the other hand, as I said, is opportunistic. Tomorrow, if they need something from China, they will keep quiet. As you know, during the time of Cameroon, we went to China. He wanted to talk about the Dalai Lama. The Chinese said, can you shut up on this if you want to trade? And he shut up until today. He has not said anything about the Dalai Lama. Okay? So these are difficult things. Politics is not, clean. Politics is always gray. Where you draw the line and how you draw is difficult.
Thank you very much. The next question is related to alternatives. Given the unreliability of the United States as a partner, what alternative systems have been created to minimize the risk to the Iran in the future if something like this happens again?
I think what is being realized globally is that, firstly, that the whole era of sanctions has created a lot of resilience inside Iran. Secondly, the rest of the world will not tolerate not trading with Iran under this kind of pretenses. So the United States will have to relax or lose its lead in this area to China. China, Russia may start to deal in their own currencies or things like that and create an economic bloc in that sense, especially now that both China and Russia are threatened with similar kinds of sanctions by the United States. So it is a very big game of chess. And as those who know, Iranians are probably one of the best chess players, right? So hope that they can negotiate this minefield more successfully than the United States.
Thank you very much. One question which is on YouTube. What happens if the current talks are unsuccessful? Is there likely to be a war against Iran, and could this war lead to regime change as in Iraq?
I don't think there is likely to be a war, although one should never say never. Because if you look at the implications, first of all, a war will not bring any clear victory. Secondly, a war cannot destroy the knowledge which has already been built up. A war may only hasten Iran's resolve to be a nuclear power, which is a much more dangerous situation than we are in today. And thirdly, in a war, the United States has been fighting for 20 years in Afghanistan. It has not been able to defeat the Taliban, even up to today. For them to now think of taking on Iran, pure madness. That will destroy the United States in the long term.
Thank you very much. A question that's come in by text. The West knows that Iran has no intention of making a nuclear bomb, so why are they worried about Iran nuclear enrichment?
whatever we say, nuclear enrichment is a capability which can facilitate the development of the nuclear weapon. So the know-how is very critical. And the initial position of the United States before the coming of Obama and during the Bush era was that there should be no enrichment in Iran whatsoever. And then Iran said, this doesn't make sense. You should then ban enrichment everywhere else. So it is realized that this is not a tenable position. But the only way to put pressure is to convince your people in the West that Iran is intent on building a nuclear weapon, although they are saying they are not. Because that's the only way you can justify creating all these headaches, right? But now that the know-how is there, it's easy to eradicate at all. As you know, in Pakistan, only one person, Abdul Qadir Khan, was able to develop a whole network and build a nuclear bomb. Yeah, so it's not something which can be stopped willy-nilly. And Iran is a country with rich technical and intellectual resources. It's not like Saudi Arabia or UAE, where the technical resource stream is very, very thin on the top. Okay. So the question now is, do you want to leave this and alienate these people even further, or do you want to reach some accommodation? That was the of the JCPOA. There are factions and forces who like to create and havoc in the region, because otherwise the attention focuses onto them, which they don't want.
Thank you. We've got two questions here that have come. Do they want to ask directly? They are here. Nizar Uncle or Mohammed Khalil, would you like to ask directly? Just unmute yourselves if you would. I'll give you a couple of minutes, but in the meantime, let me ask another one of the questions that has come through. Are there alternative financial mechanisms by which trade can occur if the US doesn't want it to occur? Or is there a monopoly on banks and the way that they trade, which makes such alternatives impossible?
The problem is this: there is no 100% monopoly of banks, especially in non-trade. What the United States says is that if, for example, Bank A deals with Iran in euros, we will stop that bank from having access to US dollar dealings. So a lot of that bank's business will go away. Okay, so there is an indirect monopoly, if you like. The only way trade can happen now is from two willing parties, like say China and Iran, or Russia and Iran, where they exchange a certain number of goods with certain things which they need from Iran, like oil or whatever else. And this is a very inexact science, and it's very complicated, and then creates a dependency. You are not now independent. So it is at the moment very difficult, because the United States thinking of applying this same methodology to China and Russia. I'm sure in time, it may not be in the next few years, but in time, an alternative will emerge where people will say, well, let's try to leave out this dollar handicap around the neck.
Thank you. Nizar Uncle? I think you unmuted yourself a few minutes ago. Okay. Mohammed Khalil, would you like to ask your question then? I'll ask Nizar Uncle's after yours.
Sure. Assalamu alaikum. Thank you for your talk, Iqbal Uncle. And contrary to being the spare wheel that gets brought out, in fact, maybe you should be regarded as the chief engineer that takes care of the problem. But just my question was, and forgive me if it's a bit of a naive one, but it's one that sort of comes up again and again when we have discussions about Iran with friends, with colleagues, and other people. So I was asking, in the popular Western imagination, Iran remains as a large and ominous and malicious force lying in wait to cause trouble, regardless of what the reality is. When stories about Western families being torn apart by the actions of Iran's government hit the Western news, as in the case of Nazneen Zaghari-Ratcliffe, does Iran recognize this as a PR problem that comes around to bite them when democratic populations then elect leaders and lawmakers with heavy anti-Iranian sentiment?
I'm sure parts or sections of the Iranian polity recognize this problem. They want to downplay it. And there are others who want to use it to create to create more friction, because their mission is to get the United States out of there. So it's a ping pong which is out of control. And it's not helped by people like Boris Johnson when he was foreign secretary. He actually said that she went there to teach journalists or whatever. And then people said, oh, we thought she was a visitor. So I'm not defending Iran or anything else. I'm just saying that it's a complicated political game. But if you look at the parallel, say, for example, did we know that there are still 40 prisoners in Guantanamo Bay who have not charged with anything? They haven't found any evidence on them, and they have been there for 20 years now. So why nobody is speaking about them? Africa has got their black holes, which need to be looked. Obviously, they create reputational harm, but as I said, a lot of these things are also used opportunistically. When you want to not address something, for example, has not returned, I think it's 400 or 600 million pounds of Iran's money from the day of the revolution, 1978, despite 4 high court rulings in the UK that it is legal to hold this money. And now they just say, we're trying, we can't do this and that. So it's not one side, both sides. And Iran, of course, has not done itself any favors by this. I would more be in favor of expelling these people. If you don't agree with what they were doing, just expel them. And that's the end of story, instead of dragging it. But there are certain parts in the system which like to drag it and create an issue out of it.
Thank you very much. The next question from Nazar: how did Israel get away not signing the nuclear treaty? Did none of the P5 members challenge it then historically?
No, the United States supports it. The United States says it doesn't have nuclear weapons. And every time there's a discussion of a no nuclear-free Middle East, the US suddenly goes completely cold and quiet. So yeah, this is the hypocrisy which we should understand in the international system. In fact, Bishop Tutu's article in The Guardian, I think about a month ago, is beautiful, and one should read it.
Okay, thank you. One question from WhatsApp. What do you see as the prospects of commodity-dependent countries like Iran, Iraq, and Saudi Arabia in a world that is increasingly transitioning away from fossil fuels? Aren't MENA countries already losing the long-term race given their lack of economic diversification, their challenges with brain drain which undermine human capital, and their continued fragility and exposure to war, violence, and sanctions?
Okay, that's a good question. Fortunately, it's less applicable to Iran than any other country in the region. The total dependence of Iran on oil is now down to 12%, even in the best of times, okay? The bigger reserves Iran has got is of natural gas, which is obviously, it is fossil, but it is much more usable than pure, just heavy crude oil. So its reserves are of a different nature, but even there, the dependence is low. Iranian economy has evolved quite a lot to get the non-oil sectors growing quite fast. That's one. Secondly, not many people know that I think Turkey and Iran probably more Turkey, in that area and in amongst developing countries, the largest registrar of patent applications filings in the world, in that category of countries, right? So if you look at Saudi Arabia, UAE, and so on, this is negligible. But Turkey and Iran, the scientists there are registering a large number of patents or discoveries. This means that the development of science and technology in those countries is quite advanced. And in fact, if you go to Iran now, you see that a lot of things are produced locally, which were just imported before because of the plentifulness of oil. Now that oil is not there, they have got it. And agriculturally, it has nearly become self-sufficient. It also got the largest solar installations in the area. So it's something you need to look at it quite seriously. The last point I want to make is that if you look at it, you know that generally a measure which economists use as to where a country has gone is looking at life expectancy. For example, in the UK, our life expectancy is now 80 for men and 84 for women. It used to be 70, 60 before 20, 30 years, right? Iran now has reached 76 for women and 72 for men and growing. So that shows, India, for example, only 62 and 64. That Iran is doing something right at the bottom end of the picture to build the capability of its people. So I'm not worried about fossil fuel problem. I think fossil fuels, even if it manages to sell its gas reserves, Iran should create a fund like Norway and invest in the future of its people.
Thank you. Two linked questions, and then I think we'll end. Isn't the bottom line issue and cause of all problems the international reliance on the world trade on the dollar? Haven't countries such as Libya tried to distance themselves from this? I think other countries globally tried too. Isn't Europe's powerlessness that you describe due to this fact too? And linked to that, why did Instex not work?
Why is what not work?
Instex, I think the alternative mechanism that Europe tried to create to...
Yeah. As I said, the US has got a stranglehold in the sense that it can deny dollar clearance to any institution which engages in any of these. Now, if you are an HSBC, for example, 60% of your trade is dollar denominated. So you will deal with Iran on non-dollar things, 60% of your trade will be blocked, or Standard Chartered, or Lloyd's, or whatever bank it is, right? Or European banks. So yes, there is a stranglehold by the dollar. Now, as I said, if you overplay your hand, then you invite other people to think that, okay, whatever the loss, let's do it. And China and Russia are getting to the brink of it. And if other countries like Iran join it, then the long term, it's not a solution tomorrow. In the long term, this can change. Is there another question like that? No?
There is one final question. Let me just get it, which is, from the religious perspective, are there any circumstances in which Ayatollah Khamenei's fatwa on the prohibition of nuclear weapons might be reversed?
At the moment, it's the ruling is based on the idea that the destructive power of nuclear weapons is not desirable for humanity, because it's a no-win situation. 2 powers, 3 powers, all of them using nuclear weapons, right? I don't see any circumstances in which it could be, or it can be, or it will be reversed. Even the only situation I can see where it might be considered is if they use nuclear weapons on Iran itself. If somebody uses nuclear weapons on you, then obviously it opens the door on something else.
Thank you very much. I think we will end there, but just before we finish so firstly, thank you very much, Iqbal Uncle, for stepping in and being the engineer, as Ahmad Khalil said, and fixing our problems that we had. And the ambassador sends his apologies for not being able to make it today for reasons outside his control, as he states. So hopefully we can get to him another day. But before we finish, just a couple of announcements. We do have our Ramadan program, which will be starting in 3 days' time on Monday, April the 12th. That starts at 4:30 p.m. to 6 p.m. for children's classes. So if you would like your children to be involved in that, please do register your child in sikkim.org.uk/Quran-class. You can find all this information on sikkim.org.uk and click on Ramadan. So that's the children's classes. But the main program then starts at 6:30 to 7. There's a ladies only Quran Kani. If you'd like to recite Quran for ladies only, and that's on Zoom and starts at 6:30. And the main program starts on this same YouTube channel, youtube.com/SikkimTV/live, and we'll have a Quran recitation followed by dua iftitah, a salam talk, and then adhan, and ending with iftar. And then later on in the month, we will have the a'mal. Just a reminder of the types of talks we'll be having every day. They'll be 15 minutes long, and we're going to be having 3 themes this year. The first theme will be the plight of Muslims across the world. So every night in the first 10 nights, we'll have an expert in a specific area from that country. So from Nigeria, India, Senegal, Saudi Arabia, Kashmir, Yemen, France, Bahrain, Iraq, and Sudan. These are people who are experts in those areas from those countries, speaking about the situation of Muslims in those countries. So we can empathize with our Muslim brothers and sisters across the globe, which obviously is a big part of Ramadan, caring about your brothers and sisters. The second 10 nights will then be about spirituality and self-development, where we'll be having talks from Dr. Amina Inlos, Sheikh Kumail Rajani, Dr. Ali Reza Bajani, and Sheikh Hisham Helia, talking about the 7 stages of Nafs, spiritual ethics and infamies of the soul. And then the final 10 nights we'll have on the power of dua and closeness to Allah by Sheikh Bahmanpour and Sheikh Arif. So hopefully these talks will be interesting. They'll be a big part of the session. So look forward to hearing you and having you participate during the month of Ramadan, starting on Monday, inshallah. But of course, the actual first day of Ramadan will be determined by the Hilal Committee closer to the time. So thank you very much, and look forward to seeing you then. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.